further ado, I think we can kick off the second seminar of our CSS seminar series of the 2025-2026 academic year. Today, we have the great pleasure of hosting Dr. Dirk Helbing, who is a professor of computational social science at the Department of Humanities, Social and Political Sciences, and associated at the ETH Zurich's Department of Computer Science. Dr. Helbing's current studies discuss the digital society, smart cities, as well as challenges and opportunities of digital democracies. Among others, he coordinated the doctoral program titled Engineering Social Technologies for a Responsible Digital Future at TU Delft. Furthermore, he's an elected member of the German Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, and a member of the external faculty of the Complexity Science Hub, Vienna. He will be delivering a presentation titled Repairing, Reviving, and Upgrading Democracies in the Age of AI. It is a true pleasure to be hosting you for that. Thank you so very much. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for the kind invitation. So I'm going to talk today about this subject, and there's a preprint under the same title that you can have a look at. My talk will not be matching exactly the content of that paper, but kind of be inspired by the overall content. And it has two parts, basically a critique of how democracies have evolved over time in countries like Germany. Unfortunately, I don't know too much about Turkey. I should know a lot more, but we'll have to figure out yourself what of what I'm saying can be transferred to Turkey or not. And there's a second part that looks into ways to repair, revive, and upgrade democracy. So I'll start with exactly this. So already back in 2015, we've been thinking about how to build digital democracy. I mean, how to use digital means to upgrade democracies, not just to map today's democracies into a digital version of democracies by e-IDs and e-voting and stuff. I think we can do a lot more with digital technologies than that. And why is it important really to study through computational science methods the subject of democracy is shown, for example, by this study over here, how networks shape diversity for better or worse. It looks at how the network structure influences the number of different opinions that exist in a society. And you can see the top network, which is very much centralized, has very little diversity resulting, which is not good from the point of view of democratic theory, which assumes that pluralism is really an essential value and core feature of a democracy. So pluralism implies diversity, and it should have a reasonable value, not infinite. And this refers to cultural, religious, work-related, social, and personal issues. So kind of diversity is not meant in the sense of queerness studies or so. It would be just a minor part of it. And so what we can learn from this is, in order for social media to support democracies, the social networks underlying those platforms need to be not too much centralized. In fact, what Strogat's network actually is doing much better than a scale-free network in terms of supporting opinion diversity. Now, I'm saying a few things that we can discuss in detail. These are statements, perspectives on democracy. Democracy, I think, is neither about winning nor about consensus. It's more like an orchestra, you know, and there are different kinds of instruments that they should learn to play together. there would be different kind of voices in a democracy, and it's the way how they come together that really determines a good outcome, according to democratic theory, I would say. So ideally, there would be no parts of society that are singled out, but we should find ways to integrate every societal group such that they can contribute to society and to prosperity and a thriving future. Democracy is about enabling reasonable and widely acceptable solutions instead. It's about distributed knowledge and about collective intelligence. And in order to mobilize that collective intelligence, deliberation plays a big role. And there have been some people thinking about how we can use the possibilities of the digital age to allow for deliberation on a massive scale using open online forums. You may have heard of Polis, for example, in Taiwan, which has been making very constructive contributions to policy making, while some social media platforms have in recent years rather undermined a constructive dialogue among people. Now, the underlying concept, I think, of democracies is something like swarm intelligence or collective intelligence. And you know these impressive examples of bird flocks, for example, and you would often think, how are they actually doing it? If this were airplanes, they could not really do this without producing a collision. But birds, even though they don't own big computers, they can do that easily. Then 300 years back, there was the fable of the bees, and it basically suggested that our society could work like a beehive. And a beehive is based on differentiated groups of bees and differentiated groups of behavior. And there is a queen bee, but the queen bee does not give commands to every bee. A queen bee basically lays eggs and makes sure that the hive survives. And the bees somehow self-organize themselves. So the idea was our societies could learn something from the way beehives are organizing themselves into a society. And it's still of interest to biologists how that works, actually. And in humans, there is a similar phenomenon called collective intelligence, or sometimes also called the wisdom of crowds. This famous example of estimating the weight of an ox, and most people would get it wrong, but the average would typically match the true value very well. This is just a simple example based on statistics, basically. But the overall challenge is really, what are frameworks that allow us to bring the best ideas of many minds together? How would we have to organize this such that it happens? And a very impressive example, a lot more complex than estimating the weight of an ox, is actually given by the Netflix prize. And here, Netflix was offering $1 million to that group of people that was able to improve their own prediction algorithm for how much people like certain movies, how they rate them, to improve their own algorithm based on big data just by 10%. You'd think it's not a difficult challenge, but it took more than 2 years for the first team to succeed, and that team only succeeded by combining their leading solution with an inferior solution of another team. So kind of something that you would think could never improve the solution was unexpectedly really making them succeed. And then other teams were also combining their solutions with each other and were able also to cross the 10% improvement threshold. So, in other words, it's not the single best solution that wins, but a combination of solutions. In a sense, diversity wins. If we just bring things together. We have many complex challenges today in the world, and in order to see really the full problem in proper detail, in all its aspects, it requires different perspectives. One perspective is typically not enough. And this is why diversity is so important, that not everyone would see the world in the same way, because this way a lot of those aspects would be overlooked. It turns out, and this is scientifically proven, that diversity is important for innovation, for prosperity, for resilience, for collective intelligence, and for democracies, also for markets, by the way, financial markets. And we've been working on an incentive scheme that would make people explore alternative perspectives and thereby improve the level of collective intelligence created. And this allowed us to come up with an approach that was better than market dynamics and also better than majority voting that is often common in parliaments, for example. So we know how to make things better, and now we call this minorities report, not minority report. Minority report is a totalitarian system that surveils everyone and then applies predictive policing and cracks down on individuals. Minorities report is just the opposite kind of, it's a bottom-up approach, right? Where everyone can make a contribution to a better solution. This PNAS paper describes how. Importantly, in order to allow collective intelligence to happen, the process needs to be organized in different steps. Phase one, there should be an independent exploration. That means people should look for different solution approaches, should look for information independently from each other. And only after this phase, they would come together and exchange information with each other. And based on that, in phase three, they would try to integrate different solution approaches to come up with better solution approaches that's satisfying for even more people. And in the ideal case, in this way, there would be an integrated solution eventually that everyone agrees with, but if not, in case there are several competing integrated solutions, then in phase four we would vote. And the interesting thing is you can do voting even if people disagree about the goals. So voting allows for plurality to come in and still come to a decision. Importantly, however, yes-no majority voting, even though it's the most common way of voting, is among the worst voting methods. And this has various issues. There is, among others, this tyranny of the majority that can result from majority voting. Even a tyranny of a minority could happen in extreme cases, but also the majority rule typically undermines spatial fairness. So suppose the citizens of a city would decide how to spend money on projects. And then in most cases, most of the money actually ends up in the city center. And that has a very simple reason. It's because there are more people living there. There's a higher density of the population. And so the periphery often doesn't get much of the money. And so it's spatially unfair. And that eventually, over many decades, often creates social tension, perhaps even conflict. We've seen that, among others, in France, the banlieues, and in many other countries also we know of the city-hinterland divide. So this is an issue that we have in many places, and it's somehow related to that majority voting approach. So we need better, different voting rules. And the question is, what can we do? How can we really improve democracy? And importantly, voting has two parts. One is voting input, that's typically collected through ballots, which try to figure out the voter preferences, typically in a simplified way. Then those ballots go into a voting box, a ballot box, and then there is a voting or vote aggregation that determines the democratic outcome. However, there are different voting inputs, and we have actually done experiments with an app that we have created for this purpose. And here are just some examples. So one of these methods is approval voting. There are different options to choose from, and you would approve a few of those options, and this would go into the ballot box and eventually be aggregated. Then there is combined approval voting. This is more differentiated. Here you can approve, you can abstain, or you can disapprove. Again, it goes into the ballot box. Then there is rank voting or border score, where the people rank the different solution proposals. So now it's being changed in the order, and that would go into the ballot box after the first ranked proposal gets 4 points, say the second one gets 3 points, and so on. And then there is cumulative voting, and many more, but cumulative voting is an example where you have 10 points, for example, and you could distribute them in a different way. So this way you can indicate which of those proposals you like more or less. You can weight those proposals, and again, this goes into the ballot box. Now, this was about different possibilities to organize the input method, right? And the question is, what difference does it make if we change the input method? It's all a democratic approach. Now, also, when it comes to aggregation, there are different possibilities. Most common is majority voting, and so basically, let's say we have a certain amount of money to spend. We spend it on those projects that get most votes, and these would be those two projects, and then it turns out the budget has been used up by those two projects, and the other projects cannot be realized. However, the majority voting actually does not pay attention to the costs, really. There is another approach where you would basically look at the ratio of number of votes versus costs. I mean, you divide votes by costs, and then you get a different order in which you would approve projects. And here it turns out there are 4 projects that could be realized with the same budget. So there's a different outcome, and this approach would consider the cost of the project, which I think is a pretty reasonable thing. And there's the method of equal shares, where people would have basically the same amount of virtual money, and that could be distributed over the projects, and all the projects that collect enough money from all the voters would then eventually be realized. Okay? In simple words, a bit more complicated. So altogether, however, the different aggregation rules produce different outcomes. And so if you look at the left-hand side, this is a typical outcome for majority voting. So what you see is there's one project that basically eats up almost all the budget, and then there's very little budget for other projects, you know. And many people are unhappy. But with the other approaches, the knapsack approach and the equal shares approach, you see we have a very different outcome in terms of the projects that are being selected. And there are a lot more projects being selected because people pay attention to the cost of projects, right? So it's probably a better way of spending money. Also, there are more people who would be happy because there are more projects realized, right? So far, that's all theory. And we have actually then put it to the test in a real world application of participatory budgeting. And you have heard about it probably many times, that many cities have been exercising this, among them Barcelona. And here this news article says only in this way a digital democracy can be sustainable. We have done it in a Swiss city named Aarau. And the project was called Stadtidee, or City Idea. And I've been participating in this in person, and you also see our PhD student at that time, Josh. And so that was one of the meetings, and there was citizen deliberation of what could be done with some budget that the city was willing to spend on projects. And Mentimeter was used, among others, in order to identify what matters. And then eventually people had some ideas and proposals for projects that could be realized, and the brainstorming results would be put on the map of Aarau. So now you see the sticky notes that indicate also where the projects would be realized. And it turned out that in the beginning there were 161 ideas. And there were several sessions, and in those sessions, people were figuring out which projects make sense, which projects can be merged with each other, which projects can be realized with reasonable effort and budget. And so eventually there were 33 projects that were put to the vote. And in other words, people could not only influence the outcome by voting over the budget that the city was willing to provide, but all those projects were proposed by the citizens themselves. Of course, there were some city representatives joining that entire process, supporting it, but basically this was driven by the citizens themselves. And then eventually they voted, and you see that they are now distributing their 10 points according to the cumulative voting, and then the method of equal shares is being applied, and this is now being processed in this animation. And so one project didn't make it, that money would be redistributed over the other projects, and eventually some projects are selected, and it turns out those are mainly those projects that have a lot of votes as compared to the costs, right? So all those projects above that red line have a very good vote versus cost ratio. and that means the money was particularly well spent, and also people didn't know beforehand about the voting method that would be applied, so they were cautious about asking not for too much money. So they were really thinking about how much money do we really need in order to realize this project, so the likelihood they would get enough votes to be approved would be higher. And that saved a lot of money, and that allowed to implement a lot more projects. So it turns out that, as you can see on the right-hand side, 17 projects were finally selected of 33. If majority voting had been applied, it would only have been 7 projects, as shown on the left. And those projects would have been only in the center. So kind of what happened with our new approach, cumulative voting combined with methods of equal shares, that was a lot more fair in terms of the spatial distribution of those projects. Every single district of the city got some project. Also, it turns out that it was a lot more inclusive. So there were more elderly people than usual participating. There were more younger people than usual participating. There were more females participating than usual, and also more foreigners. And so this approach had a lot of benefits. And in conclusion, we can say democracy can be upgraded. We can have more projects with the same budget approved and realized. We can have a better resourcefulness. We can have more participation, more inclusion, more transparency, more trust, more satisfaction, and more spatial fairness. And this is something that you cannot achieve by a classical optimization approach that would typically determine the average of utility functions of people, if that were possible, and then determine the optimal solution to that average utility function, even though it may represent no one. And that supposedly optimal solution would be implemented. Our approach is pluralistic, is multi-dimensional, and therefore it's better than optimal. Now, we have then thought, could we also apply voting to other situations? And we were looking into traffic simulations. And what typically is done when you optimize traffic light control, for example, is that you want to minimize travel times. So you assume everyone has the same utility function. But that's actually not true. Some people may want to maximize sustainability, minimize the number of stops, or minimize fuel consumption, or whatever. Use a beautiful route. So let's assume a pluralistic approach where people would have different goal functions. They would enter it into their route guidance system in the car. And then based on this, the car would determine a different kind of route. And we have even developed an app for this called routify.ch. And what happens is that at each intersection, at each traffic light, there's a different distribution of cars and goal functions in the course of the day. And in each moment, the traffic light responds to the distribution of goal functions that is around that intersection. And so the control logic is changing. It's adapting to the real interests and needs to the cars or drivers. And what is interesting is that it really has a very beneficial effect on the outcome. If we optimize just for one goal, say efficiency, then we would ideally get a 100% optimal solution. But then if we also care about other variables such as sustainability and resilience, it often turns out that there the solution would be performing very poorly. While with our approach, the voting-based approach, that would create a solution that is not 100% optimal for one single goal, but it would be highly performing for many goals. And altogether, it would be a better solution. As you can see, the area under the triangle representing the solution is much bigger. So you have a much better overall solution. You're satisfying many goals at the same time at a high level. And that's what we really need. So democracy should be about pluralistic solutions which create benefits for many. We have division of labor, people have different jobs, different backgrounds, so they need different conditions to thrive. And that's why we need pluralism. And then we've been thinking about another approach, how to get there. An approach of co-creation, also a participatory approach, obviously, that we call remixing. And this is about how solution proposals would be created. So today it's often done by experts, but in the future, also considering that better and better generative AI tools get available, that could be done by people. So suppose we would want to find out how to use a certain space in the city. So it's an urban planning challenge. And you could consider that on the one hand, experts are coming up with proposals. But you could also consider that using suitable tools, citizens themselves would make proposals, and then other citizens would take those proposals and modify them, improve them, and there would eventually be different proposals on the table, and those interesting ones would be further processed and changed and improved by others. And so there would be a branching process of solutions that are being produced. So this is step one, peer production. Would be many different solutions. And nobody could have a look at all those solutions because there would be just too many. So we need a distributed approach of selecting the best proposals. That would be done by peer review in a sense. So everyone would just see 5 or 10 proposals, perhaps randomly selected, and make a short list, rank those proposals, and from those best of lists, there would be finally a list created with the 10 best solutions identified in this distributed way, and everyone would then vote on those 10 different proposals. The interesting point is, mathematically you can show that even though nobody assesses all the proposals, the proposals that will be on that short list of 10 proposals, those will all be very good proposals. So you can trust that even though you don't have control of all these proposals, that collective intelligence will sort it out. And we have further then studied what would be the best way of organizing it, whether we should keep the information of those plans private or share it, whether we should try to keep only optimal solutions at each point in time, or keep all solutions, and then let things evolve. And as you can see over here, M4 is the best solution, where we have an evolution-oriented approach and sharing of information. So this will benefit everyone, including minorities, and so that would be the best if you wanted to really advance our society quickly to a new level. Now, there are other things that matter for societies. They stand for values. We have, of course, democratic values, constitutional values. They're also part of the Universal Charter of Human Rights. And there are some handbooks about value-sensitive design, or design for values, that can inform us about how to do things. We can also create democracy by design. And when you create a digital platform, there are many design decisions. And the principle is that when you have different options, just do what is more democratic, which is more supportive of democratic values. And then this will produce better platforms for democracies, platforms that would not be undermining democracies, but platforms that would be supporting democratic values. What are those democratic values? There are many of them: human rights, human dignity, freedom, self-determination, pluralism, protection of minorities, division of power, checks and balances, participation, transparency, fairness, justice, legitimacy, presumption of innocence, anonymous equal votes, privacy, which means like protection from exposure and misuse, and also the right to be left alone. And probably there are more even than those values, but those are some important values, and one should try to consider them. And also a very important value would be informational self-determination. That means if we collect data of people, that should go into a data mailbox, a personal data mailbox that you are in control of. So you should be able, perhaps using even an AI-based solution, to manage the use of your data and your digital twin, and to determine which company is allowed to use what part of your data for what product or service. I think this is very important. So protecting the dignity of every human is a fundamental principle. And you had recently visited by the Pope, and there he actually stressed exactly this point, that the dignity and freedom of all people is important to protect. Accordingly, humans should not be treated like animals, robots, machines, things, data, or worthless. Humans are special because they have a consciousness, they have cognitive properties, they feel pain. And this makes us different and needs a different treatment. Knowledge about our personality, however, allows for the personalization of products and services, and that makes us also, unfortunately, vulnerable. And that's why, at least in Germany, but also in many other countries, there are legal frameworks for that protection. And according to a sentence of the Supreme Court in Germany, the state is responsible to protect us from the registering and cataloging of our personality. And also, they would have to protect us with regard to third parties. That could be companies, that could be also other countries. Human dignity is also instrumental for thriving societies, for example, for trust, collaboration, and peace. Now, this is how things should be. The question is, how are things really at the moment? What is really going on? And I'm trying to give some insights into this, and it's not going to give a full picture, unfortunately, but I'm trying to do my best to give you some ideas of why these days certain things have become troublesome. So rather than representative democracies in the sense that the people in the parliament should be a proportional representation of the entire population, like kind of a small sample of the society, but representing all the different interests proportionally, rather than this, which would very much be suited to support collective intelligence. Rather than this, we often have democracies of representatives. It could also be lobbyists. It turns out that a couple of years back in Germany, there was this call for a market-conform democracy. It has created an outcry among many people and the media. So here's a quote: "We live in a democracy," and so on. This is why budgetary authority is a core right of parliament. Therefore, we will find ways to shape parliamentary participation in such a way that it is market conform. And then the question is, what happened? Nobody told us in detail, but here's one of the news that might relate to this. So eventually, it turns out representatives of companies were working for the ministries. They were kind of rental officers that were basically writing the laws that would apply to the companies that they were representing. So this is the way basically democracy was streamlined to match the interests of companies. And here's another interesting thing. So eventually a software was developed, and this was developed in collaboration between Fortune 500 companies and the military. And that software was based on big data, surveillance data, actually. And it was used not only in the context of international battles, but also to help simulate the non-kinetic aspects of combat, things like diplomatic, economic, political, infrastructure, and social issues. That means basically companies were working together to shape diplomatic, political, economic, and social affairs. Right? And the question now that we need to look in, was that something playing out well for our societies, or is the algorithmic collusion implied by this approach just the smallest problem? So what they've done, more specifically, they've created a digital twin of the world, but one where every single person, like you and me, would also be represented by a learning black box and would be fed by surveillance data and would learn to behave increasingly like we do. So personalized digital twins that would then be used to simulate the world and could be used in order to see how we would respond to certain kind of happenings, to certain kind of information input, and that could be used basically to shape our behavior. So the question is, could a surveillance-based, data-driven, AI-controlled benevolent dictator, in a sense, benefit us? And a benevolent dictator would be basically surveillance-based, data-driven, and AI-controlled. Right? It's not really a person. And so what we've seen in the past is, in fact, that there were these attempts to shape people's opinions, feelings, and behaviors, and also to shape consent, to engineer agreement with certain kind of things. And this is about 100 years old. It comes from Edward Bernays, as you can see. He was written a book on propaganda, and among others, Hitler has been using it to create mass psychology. Goebbels was helping him, and that was creating the basis of his power. But it ended in a terrible way. So there was Second World War, 80 million people were dying. There was a Holocaust. And so it was really a terrible ending of this political experiment. And it's not like this method is not anymore being used. It's just called differently now. It's now called public relations. And it's become a lot more powerful recently through the digital revolution, which basically helped to scale propaganda to make it applicable 24/7. Every second it's trying to grab our attention, and it can also be used to personalize information. So what happened is that back around 2015 or so, the control of the internet was handed over to multi-stakeholder institution called ICANN. And from that point onwards, the internet was being used and organized in a different way. Personalized information became possible. So if you and I click the same internet link, we may see different content, like different prices, for example. And Barack Obama knew the implications of this, and that's why he was warning us. Here's a quote of his last correspondence dinner speech. So this is also a time around the world when some of the fundamental ideas of liberal democracies are under attack, and when notions of objectivity and of a free press and of facts and of evidence are trying to be undermined, or in some cases ignored entirely. So this opened up basically the fact-free world, the post-fact society, and this enabled bubbles, hypes, fake news, disinformation, deception at an entirely new level. And I think information distortion has become a very serious problem. Unfortunately, we're living in an attention economy. I mean, we're being overloaded with information, which basically makes us defensive. We cannot really check every information. and therefore we basically tend to follow the suggestions. But selective attention means that we would only consciously notice about 5 or 10% of the information that flows into our brain. And many things we would overlook, and that can be used really to distract us, but also to manipulate us. Now, attention is really being sold in auctions and on the second basis. So when you open a web page and there's some ad, there's an auction that basically determines who gets to see what kind of information. It's all personalized. It's based on how much money is being offered by each one who's competing for your attention. We are all being profiled and targeted. A lot of data is being collected about us, much more than you can ever imagine. Part of it we learned from Edward Snowden back in 2015. And of course, you know cookie trackers, but that's not the only way of collecting data about us. In every smartphone, there are about 20 or so sensors, and many of those sensors can be used to collect data. Some of them are forbidden to be used, but still you can get a lot of data. And that's being used basically to create digital tuples or avatars. Information basically about every aspect of our life is being collected by thousands of companies, many we don't even know by name. And some of them have created personal profiles, highly detailed, even more detailed than this. And for some time it was possible even to look up the personality of everyone on the internet before data protection stepped in. So you could look into the personality of your neighbor, of your colleague, or your competitor, enemy, whatever. And this would really give you insight into the strengths and weaknesses, into the desires and fears of every person. And of course, AI could use that information much more effectively to manipulate people, more effectively than friends can do. So this is basically a quote of somebody from the advertisement company. And he said, by tracking your cookies after 2 weeks, we know everything about you. And advertisement technology is completely safe to manipulate the shh out of you. It's really extremely effective. And in many cases, we would not even notice that we have been manipulated, perhaps even in our political points of view. So we have, however, not only been surveilled, spied on with digital technology, we have also become something like lab rats. So why am I saying this? Because everyone is being exposed to different kind of information environments. These are personalized environments, and with those you can manipulate people in personalized ways. And in fact, there are millions of experiments that companies are doing every day. It's called A/B testing. So people are being exposed to different kinds of information. As you can see over here, some information would be displayed to the upper right in orange, or to the upper left in blue. And then what is more effective, what makes people click more. If the text is shown in blue rather than black, what if you have some flashing elements? What if you display a woman or a man or different hair styles, colors, whatever, everything is being tested out basically. So whatever we do, computers are trying to use as input in order to learn about our behavior. And also the AI systems would learn to produce outputs that would be input for our own perception in such a way that it would manipulate our behavior in some desired way. So there's a feedback loop, and AI learns to get better and better in understanding what we do and in manipulating us. Now, why does that work so well? It's basically because our brain is a highly effective organ. It's just using 40 to 100 watts, but it can do so much more than just a light bulb. You can do many things that a supercomputer with AI on it requires a nuclear power station for. But the brain simplifies things. And those simplifications can be used to hack the brain. There are many cognitive biases, as you can see with them, dozens of them that can be used basically to hack the brain, to trick us. And secret services, among others, now also advertisement companies have learned increasingly to hack the brain by using those cognitive biases and basically program computer code to use each of those different cognitive biases on the push of a button or even in an automated way. And so our choices are being manipulated by personalized information. We call this micro-targeting or big nudging. Big comes from big data. And Tristan Harris, who's worked in a Google control room for some time, has given a brilliant TED talk where he explains how a handful of tech companies controls billions of minds every day. Have a look at this. Also, there was this Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, which describes how digital twins are being created about each one of us. The more we interact with the digital systems, the more accurate and predictive the digital twin becomes. And that will allow the companies and institutions using those technologies to manipulate ever more effectively, in most cases without us even noticing. So it becomes possible to shape our thinking, emotions, and behavior to a considerable extent. There's also some books that basically triggered that interest in such kind of approaches. One of those books is called Nudge. It's from Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And their approach is sometimes called liberal paternalism, but it also has been criticized a lot. This kind of approach has been used in political systems around the world, politics by psychotricks, and so-called nudge units or behavioral insight labs have been created around the world. There are more than 80 of them. These are basically trying to shape our behavior. And the question is, would it really create better societies and better people? Or would it basically enforce conformity and damage the diversity that would be important for innovation, for prosperity, and for societal resilience? And in fact, if you have a look at another book of Richard Thaler, then you can really get the impression this is not about flocks of birds as we see them in reality, and I've showed you a video of it. This is more like a very strict, almost totalitarian kind of organization that somehow is attempted to be created by this so-called liberal paternalism. So it doesn't seem to be liberal, and it's perhaps something that we should be concerned about. Now, what happened shortly later is that people warned that these kind of approaches could also be used to manipulate elections. So the warnings came up in 2015, I think. Shortly later, in 2016, we had the Brexit vote. People were very much stunned about it. And there was this very strange article, Brexit, the first major casualty of digital democracy, where basically it's being suggested that people don't even know what they want and what to vote for in these digital times. See, there's also this slogan, order from chaos. And I've then had an interview with a journalist, and the journalist was asking me, is this swarm intelligence really working so well? Um, and the title over here says basically, elites destroy the oracle of the masses, destroy the swarm intelligence, but the oracle of the masses is the democratic vote. So what has happened is basically systems have been created to undermine democracy, and that's exactly what we learned through the Cambridge Analytica scandal. In fact, it was known already before that social influence can undermine the wisdom of crowd. There's three different effects at least. Social influence effect: opinions converge without improving accuracy. When people interact repeatedly with each other and exchange information about what they voted for. Range reduction effect: truth gets marginalized. And the confidence effect: confidence increases while accuracy is actually going down. Okay, so swarm intelligence, in other words, is vulnerable. And this vulnerability has been exploited. It has been exploited by military propaganda that has been privatized, that has been going into the private sector and advertisement. And so weaponized propaganda AI has been created that knows us better than we know ourselves. And in the meantime, there are many publications and books about it. And as you can see over here, targeting has been used basically to break democracies, to create something like data dictatorships. And for many years now, in more than 65 countries, democratic elections have been undermined in this way. So we have not had any anonymous, free and fair elections for a long time. And that's not all. I told you that attention is being auctioned in a second frequency. So attention is being auctioned in a personalized way. And it turns out that this can also be used basically to manipulate politicians and military people. So it has made people vulnerable, including military people. And so it has become really a threat to national security finally. We've ended up in a hybrid war where information warfare and cognitive warfare are parts of it. And so it's really a fight for our brains and our opinions and our emotions and what we're doing. A fight between different countries, but also between different companies, and there are many different actors that want us to think and feel and do differently, and that is very stressful to people. Among others, one can use data collected by cybersecurity centers. And the issue, however, is we can try to make cybersecurity better and better, but there's probably no perfect solution. So I've been talking to an insider who really was familiar with a lot of things most people don't know of in connection with technology. And he was basically saying by 2036 we'll have solved more or less all problems, referring to superintelligence, I think, apart from two. And it turns out climate change and cybersecurity are the two things with no solution that he knew of. What does that really mean? It means that you can try to improve cybersecurity and may be able to do that. It will be very costly, but it will never be enough. There will be an arms race, a cat and mouse game basically. We'll never get things safe. And this has partly to do with also misinformation. Now, if you have two equally strong computers and you use one of them to produce false claims, disinformation, and you have another computer being used to filter out untrue claims, it will turn out that it's easier to produce disinformation than to filter it out. And that's why you cannot win this battle, basically. So you can spend all the money of your society and will not be able to fix it. So it's an unsolvable problem that you can make a lot of money with, but it will explode our society, basically. Then also, I'd like to warn that we are probably in a situation where our current ways are at the risk of destroying themselves. So, why am I saying this? For many years, we know about a problem that's called typically the tragedy of the commons. And however, it's a bit misleading because what this really is about is what would be the outcomes if many different players decide selfishly. And what is shown in this publication in Science is that if people decide selfishly, then you can end up in a so-called tragedy where the systemic outcome is bad, even though it could be a lot better in that system. Just the good solution is unstable, the bad solution is stable. And that's why this is happening, even though nobody wants this to happen. Now, it turns out that actually people are actually not that selfish as is often being claimed. But companies and corporations, they do try to strictly optimize. They do try to be perfectly selfish. So kind of this tragedy applies a lot more to companies and corporations than to people. And it's expected to cause a systemic failure if we live in a system where everyone selfishly competes against everyone else. And obviously, cooperation would not result. Then some people say, okay, that's why we need a centralized control. We need a control room. The military basically needs to be able to step in and fix the side effects of what people and companies are doing. And the question is that going to save us? So we've been looking into a somehow similar problem, much simpler though, and this is about traffic light control. Among others, we've been looking into this pretty widespread paradigm of a traffic control center. So there's a central control that tries to act like a benevolent dictator. So the center tries to collect as much data as possible about the traffic situations throughout the system, and then based on data, it tries to come up with the best possible control, like a benevolent dictator. So, center tries to do the best thing for everyone. Turns out, however, it's an NP-hard optimization problem. That means even a supercomputer would not be able to do that in real time for Istanbul or even for Zurich. So simplifications need to be made, and the way the simplifications are made is that it turns out that a lot of good solutions that nobody thought that would be good would be thrown away. Second approach is one which is inspired by economics. Each intersection would try to strictly minimize travel time, but would not pay attention to what every other intersection is doing. So it would be local optimization, but no coordination. So you'd think, well, that cannot really perform as well as a centralized traffic control. And the third thing is the same as in the middle, but if there's a long queue, we would first clear that queue before we go back to travel time minimization. So it's an other regarding approach with regard to neighboring intersections, and we would think that this would be even worse than in the middle because it would be friendly to our neighbors, but it would reduce our own performance. Now, it turns out the red line corresponds to centralized traffic light control. The more capacity utilization, the more traffic volume we have, the higher is the queue length of cars waiting behind the red lights. That's what we expect. No, nothing special here. Okay. Then the Homo economicus approach is the dashed violet line over here. It turns out to be much better for low capacity utilization, but then eventually the queue length explodes. That means after some time the approach doesn't work anymore, and traffic control center would say, see, that's why you need a traffic control center. The third approach, however, turns out to be better all the way, even though it combines two approaches that each of them doesn't work, but the combination of them surprisingly does produce a better outcome, as I said, all the way. And so we can make self-organization work, we can make the invisible hand work. And you can see it has actually been implemented in some cities and tested and evaluated scientifically very carefully, among others in Lucerne in Switzerland. And this was the state-of-the-art solution that I had before. See several traffic lights, cars are waiting. When they're waiting, there's red lines. And there's a lot of red lines, as you can see, so there's a lot of waiting. While here with our self-control approach, there's less regular green waves than above. Still, there are green waves that are forming in a self-organized way, but importantly, waiting times are much reduced. Actually, for everyone. That means not just for cars and cyclists, but also for public transport and for pedestrians. And quite significantly reduced. So as a result, there was more green for everyone just by not wasting green time when it was not needed. So in conclusion, we cannot control everything top down. And we need a new paradigm. We need to go from control to coordination, an assistant. And this is what I'm describing in my book Next Civilization, where I look at two approaches: the top-down control approach enabled by digital technology, but also by at the bottom-up self-organization based approach that we find in many complex systems, that we can learn how to use it for us. And I want to encourage you really to be a game changer. There are actually some things that you can do. So you can apply a value-sensitive design approach. You can invent tech that protects human rights and our environment too. You can build freedom tech. And you can replace the social engineering benevolent dictator approach by assisted self-organization, by symbiotic co-evolution, and by boosting serendipity. That means lucky coincidences and unexpected opportunities. And with this, I've arrived at the end of my talk, and I'm very much looking forward to your interesting and challenging questions.
Thank you so much for this truly inspirational talk. We all enjoyed it very much, I'm sure. So let's open the floor for any questions or maybe some of our students may have, or any of our other participants may have. You can unmute yourself and ask, but also if that's easier, you can put it in the chat box. I can read it out loud.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. So this was really inspiring and like enlightening, and especially, I mean, for for many types of like democracies, that could be a parliamentary mainstream democracy or more alternative or radical types of democracies like grassroots organizations. Your ideas and your like experiments or studies are like showing lots of possibilities, and this is really inspiring for academically and like in terms of real political practice. And one thing that I was wondering, so one I think problem about typical representative democracy is that we vote and we elect some people to the office, and once they are there, so they stop working for us. They could be corrupt or they could be like working for like themselves. So I'm talking about the typical like mainstream politician in most countries that people always complain about. And this was and one thing that I always interested in to minimize this error is the practice of like recalling an elected official back by voting. So I mean we are not supposed to wait for another 4 years to elect our officials, and if we are not happy with them, we can recall back. And do you have any like plans, or have you ever considered like analyzing, simulating such kind of practice? I mean, it can take different forms, like once every year in between the elections, there can be some chances to recall them back, or it can be in a continuous manner whenever people are able to collect a number of like signatures or in using different like mobile or digital apps. So this can be figured out, but have you ever thought about that?
So, revoking some mandate is actually a very old, even ancient principle. We had thousands of years back already. So it's an established principle somehow, but I would not expect too much from it, because some people are very talented in creating certain circumstances that make people support them. And in many cases, crisis situations are creating situations that seem to create an alternative-less kind of situation where now we cannot do anything else. Now we cannot even afford to have an election. Now we cannot afford to change over control to somebody else. But because now there's a burning problem right now that needs to be addressed. So I'd also like to say that while many people perceive it the way you have expressed it, even if we assume that everyone is trying to do a good job in trying to improve the situation of a society in their area, it could still end up with a failing system, as I'd explained with the tragedy of the commons example. And in fact, there is a good example, which was the financial crisis back in 2007-8. And at that time, Her Majesty, the Queen of Great Britain, she had asked in a letter why nobody had seen this coming. And then there was actually a very interesting letter where it was explained that everyone was doing their job, and in most cases they were doing it well, but still kind of different things were adding up in such a way that systemic instability resulted that nobody could be really blamed for. And from a scientific perspective, that is particularly interesting for me. I think it's also easier to discuss about things if we don't try to blame each other, One other way of approaching things would be to say, Well, even if our politicians are trying to do their very best, they have limitations. They have limitations of budget, they have limitations of time, they have limitations of capacity in terms of how many people are available to put certain kind of things in practice, and so on. And so the question is, how can we overcome those limitations? And here, a participatory approach, as I have explained it in different settings, can be a solution because it increases capacity of the society to solve problems. It involves more people, and in many countries, many democracies, there are lots of smart people, lots of people who've gone to school, lots of people with a university degree, lots of intelligent people who also highly motivated, with many talents, some of them also with financial and other resources. So if we could really integrate this more into the societal process and progress, I think it could make a big difference. But for this, it needs to be realized that there's not just one person who's right about what is the right thing to do or about the future, but it needs many people to look at a problem from different perspectives. As I said before, this example of the elephant. That is required in order to come up with better solutions, and this is where the collective intelligence can make a positive difference if it's organized well, if it's not being hijacked, as it could also happen. So yeah, I think opposition is a difficult approach, and not always. There is a guarantee for success, and if there is a way kind of finding possibility to open up dialogue and action, that could be perhaps an alternative approach, and perhaps that would be working better. So I'd like to advertise to also consider that possibility.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm checking the participants list to see if there are any hands raised.
So can I ask a question?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead.
So we mostly talked about how corporations and elites lead us to some ideas through the algorithms, how they feed us propaganda. But we actually started to curate our own propaganda in Instagram, Twitter, or other social media sites. Even without any interruption, we actually train our own propaganda machines in the current scape of the social media. So where would you place the self-curation of propaganda within your work? Because I believe that's a very interesting thing, because it actually changes how we understand propaganda. It's not directed anymore. It's self-curated. That's how I see it. Actually, yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's both. But in fact, yes, everyone is voluntarily or involuntarily contributing to this system of propaganda. In many cases, even our friends and colleagues are being made to influence us. So kind of turned against our own interests. And this is something which I consider quite problematic. Yes, everyone is adding content, and everyone is trying to influence people's opinions on social media. From that point of view, it could also be perhaps labeled as propaganda. At least it's something one can discuss. Okay. That doesn't mean that most of our own social media engagements would ever have a chance to really change the outcome of societal developments. I think the algorithms have been made this way that we cannot really effectively change much. Rather, the algorithms can make us think the way those who have power and money want us to think. But we are certainly adding to this distraction machine. It's social media is also a weapon of mass distraction. And I told you about the attention economy. We are spending quite a lot of time on average in the internet, social media. And as long as we're spending time there, we probably won't really change the world. Perhaps we have the impression we've said something important, but is it really going to change anything? I don't think so. So it's a way to absorb our creative power, and it's a way to distract us from those developments that are really important, that are happening often silently in the background. And so we're not paying attention to them, we're paying attention to what makes noise. And that noise is, in part at least, intentional to distract us. So if you really are interested in what is happening in society, what are the important things, then you should pay more attention to what are the things that there's very little reporting about, that happen while there's a lot of noise about something else. There are some well-documented cases where tricky parliamentarian decisions, for example, about mass surveillance in Germany, have been taken just when there was a soccer game, and everyone paid attention to soccer instead. Or there was a discussion about gay marriage or things like that, which everyone got crazy about. But it was just a distraction strategy. And so whenever these kind of things happen, we need to pay attention. It could tell us that something important is happening elsewhere. Okay, I see another hand.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Adam.
hocam.
Thank you, Professor, for this great presentation. I really enjoyed because I also work on this topic. I wrote my master thesis on whether Brexit and 2016 Trump campaign can be considered as an episode of democratic backsliding. And the argument was rest on whether micro-targeted online advertisement can be considered as a democratic backsliding episode. Because from the Trump campaign, we know that these micro-targeted advertisements are used for voter suppressions. So Trump campaign mostly targeted people who they assume are more likely to vote for Clinton. And with certain messages, they try to deter them. However, I have two questions regarding that. The first one is, we still don't know whether micro-targeted online advertising has an effect on voting behavior, whether it is much more powerful on independent voters, whether it has an effect on partisan voters. Does time and context differ? So I was just wondering your opinion on that. How can we scientifically measure the effect of micro-targeting on voting behavior within the boundaries of IRB, the ethical scientific inquiries? And the second of all is that I think the major thing that causes this whole episode is the profit imperative of the social media companies, because they want to sell more advertisements to have a better targeting techniques, and to better sell advertisements they need to extract more data. To extract more data, they want more distractive contents on our screens and so on. But there's also a dilemma in there, because these companies can be state owned, so that we can remove the profit imperative, but that could lead to some totalitarian practices. It can't be still free. My view is that it could be turned into a paid model. So if people start to pay for using the platforms, then their algorithms could be less radical, and then there will be no need for giving advertisements. So these are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Yeah, we need to realize that those platforms are in fact commercial and they've not been created to support democracy, but for power, profit, and propaganda. And the question is, are the methods applied by those platforms legitimate from democratic point of view? And I think they're highly problematic. It's not clear to me how micro-targeting is compatible with privacy protection. If you basically say send some hate speech to every scientist in computational social science in Zurich, aged 50 plus, you can predict who is going to get it. So there's no privacy protection, basically, I think. And also micro-targeting violates fairness. It's kind of a principle that, by definition, produces bias. It's highly problematic, and it has created the possibility for hybrid warfare, which I think is very much undermining the foundation's democracies at the moment, and is also now threatening national security. So I'm not sure we'll have that forever. As I said, I think what we should have is that all the personal data that is being created about us should go into a personal data mailbox, and we should have control ourselves over that personal data. So companies would have to convince us they're going to do good things with the data that we share with them. We could decide how much personal data, which kind of personal data we want to share with different companies, to allow them to come up with personalized products and services. So kind of, if I want them to do that for me, I can still allow for that if I have that informational self-determination platform. I think that will be the solution. That would be protecting our democratic and interests and human rights. And at the same time, it would allow for all personalization just if companies can convince us they're doing a good job for us. So that would change a lot of things. And I'm pretty sure I've forgotten part of your question, so could you perhaps repeat that part again?
Yeah, the part was that we still don't know whether
Okay.
micro-target techniques can have an effect on voting behavior. So how can we?
Yeah, I do honestly think it's a little bit like with cigarette consumption and things like that, and also climate change. There's a lot of disinformation about this. Honestly, if micro-targeting wouldn't work, companies and advertisement companies and those who pay those advertisement companies, and they're paying lots of money, billions, they wouldn't use it if it wouldn't work. Why would somebody create expensive infrastructures for this and expensive data collections if that wouldn't work? Kind of, it wouldn't make any sense. But those data collections are happening, and there's a lot of money flowing in the advertisement sector. Kind of 40% of a product's, let me see, 40% of the price of a product, I think, would go into advertisement. Lots of money, and it's not a perfect way of manipulating people. Still, if you apply it many times over a long period of time, You could really perhaps turn somebody who's being tolerant with regard to foreigners into somebody who starts to think, we don't want foreigners in our country. And you could certainly create that divide in a society that we see increasingly so. Now, I would say like 10 years ago, we've been living, at least in Germany and Switzerland, in a society where we were largely getting along with all sorts of people. It was fine, we loved each other, coming from all sorts of countries, cultures, religions, sexual identities, whatever, it was all okay, more or less. And that has changed. Now we have battles between young and old people. We have battles between women and men, between different sexual identities, different cultures, different religions. It's, I think this has all been engineered. And it's being engineered for the power of those who are afraid to lose their power, to make us weak. And over the years, over 10 years' time, it has been very effective. And now, yes, I do agree, the effectiveness is limited, and that's why it takes time. But now we have increasingly new kinds of technologies which are much more powerful in terms of manipulating people's minds. And that is based on converging technologies, combination of digital technology with nano and biotechnology. And what you can do with this is really, as compared to micro-targeting, extremely powerful and scary. I think this is on the way and is being rolled out step by step. And people have no idea what is possible here. And we're going to have approaches of manipulation that are a lot more powerful and effective than micro-targeting. And by the time they forbid micro-targeting, if that happens, it would probably imply that they already have the next thing, a much better thing, So we need to, at the same time, to pay attention to those developments, and you can find some papers and preprints related to this on my ResearchGate account. Okay, there's one more hand.
Berke.
First of all, welcome and thank you for the presentation. My question is that, so first we talked about the collective intelligence, and then in opposition of that, we talked about the attention economy, the surveillance, the cybersecurity threats that we have. But we also talked about the tragedy of the commons and framed it also as tragedy of the corporates. In that sense, do you think that, does this imply that the systematic opposition that we have is self-destructive in a way, that it will corrode itself to a point that collective intelligence and its actions can emerge more easily or more successfully, more prosperously? Or do you think that this process is destroying both the system and the subjects of the system, which is us, at the same time? So that's not kind of possible, and this collective intelligence has to emerge right now as fast and as active as possible to be able to make social change and for a better future, let's say.
Okay, yeah, it's a very good question. And yes, I do think we are in a situation where the old system that we know is not going to continue much longer. Everyone knows it because we know we're living not in a sustainable world. So that implies that the world we're living in is not future-proof. We know this will disappear. Something else will happen. The question is what will happen, and of course there are people who have been thinking about for the next system after the system that we have. And some people think that capitalism has to go, at least that the kind of capitalism that we have at the moment, and others think that democracy has to go. And the question is, what will really happen? We'll probably have a new financial system with a very high chance. It will be digital, but there are different forms of it, and some of them are more concerning than others. So yeah, the current system will be replaced. It will also, it would fail also if we do nothing. And in fact, this is, I think, what some people like Peter Thiel consider to be the digital apocalypse, or that is ahead. You know, many people in Silicon Valley seem to be afraid of some apocalypse. It's also that they seem to have some partly questionable religious beliefs. But you know, there's instability, and that is something that we should see as a risk and as an opportunity. Many people, you know, those that are trying to kind of keep the system as we have it, they often say that, don't worry about the digital revolution. You know, okay, AI will take away many jobs as we have them today, but you know, eventually there will be new jobs, so don't worry, we'll all be fine. But the point is that in history, whenever we had these kind of revolutionary transitions, it did not happen smoothly. There were revolutions and wars, and typically millions of people have been dying, and that's exactly what we don't want to happen. So this time we want to be smarter than last time, and we want to be able to do the transition in a way that would not kill a lot of people. And yes, I don't see it for granted that the transition that would come would be in our interest, and also that it would be a smooth transition, and it could very well happen that we end up in a war or revolution that kills a lot of people. So I think just waiting for the system to fall apart because it cannot sustain itself would be not good enough. You know, I do think we need to contribute to a smooth transition. Also, we need to think about what kind of future do we want to live in, because there are many different systems that are conceivable, and different kind of political systems that can be created using digital technology. And the good news is that in those times of instability, a single person could make a difference, which is not possible typically in stable times. In stable times, can make a huge effort and will change the system just very little. It would be very frustrating, but now is the time. Kind of, it happens perhaps every 100 years or so, or perhaps not even that often. Now we're entering the times of instability and also, as we know from physics of phase transitions and social transitions, single individuals could make a difference. Like you and me and whoever, you know, you could make a difference to a better future. And so you need to think about how you can do that. I often mention the butterfly effect. Do you know what that is? So in complexity theory, and you know, society is a complex system, there are so-called tipping points. Those are the instability points. And at these tipping points, very small changes, like the flapping of the wings of a butterfly, could make a difference. Could change the weather, not immediately, but over several months' time, it could change the weather. It's very hard to imagine, but it's mathematically proven. So, in these times of instability, very small changes can make a difference if you manage to identify such an instability point and use it for good. So this needs a little bit of experience perhaps to figure out where are the points where difference now becomes possible because stability gets lost. Perhaps it would happen, people did not even know they were at a stability point, did something and it happens by itself. But you could learn, as scientists, you could learn to find those tipping points and to make good use of it. And that's what I advise you to do.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for this really, once again, fascinating talk. We all enjoyed it very much. And we're already past our time. I don't thank you so much for sparing time for us today. Arda Mujam, any final words before we close the session?
I mean, it was so good, really. I mean, there were so many interesting things, and those who are studying and those who are interested in politics and democracy would I mean, I'm sure we have loved it. And thank you so much for your words and for being here.
And I also very much look forward to reading your book, by the way.
Okay.
That sounds fascinating. Thank you so much. And wishing you happy holidays in advance
Yeah,
and a great rest of the week to everyone.
yeah.
And the same to you. So
Happy
thanks again for your
Christmas.
interest and all the best for the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.